Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Summer of Peace. I'm Philip Helmick. I serve as a Global Peace Ambassador with the Shift Network. And, this Summer of Peace has just been so much, it's just been so timely with everything that's going on in the world with COVID-19, with George Floyd's killing, and then the protests around the world. And so, we're really hoping that you're enjoying and benefiting from these sessions. And now we have a session that it was really fun. We were reached out by Dr. McLean Dade, and I was like, wow, this person's amazing. Dr. Dade is going to be talking with us about cultural arts education, an equity, inclusion, and diversity tool. And let me tell you a little bit about Karen. Karen is the Associate Dean at Western Washington University. She's the founder and CEO of Multicultural International Development Company. And so Dr. McLean is a mastermind when it comes to using cultural arts education as an equity, inclusion, and diversity learning tool, whether for classroom, corporate, artistic production, or nonprofit agencies. She has been an academic scholar and author for more than 25 years in the field of multicultural education. And she has been a featured speaker, performer, visiting scholar, and/or consultant for numerous schools, universities, and agencies in over 40 countries. Wow, that is impressive.
That is a lot of work.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for reaching out to us. This is really nice to have you with us. So tell us a little bit how you got started into this area of expertise, this field of work that you're doing.
Okay, thank you, Philip. First, I want to just thank you for inviting me on the show. I'm thrilled to be able to do this. Since I do very much have a broad scope when it comes to matters of the world. And so it's just very appropriate to be on. And also just in thinking about the Summer of Peace, and I had to ask myself, how do I feel about that? Summer of Peace at a time when there's so much turmoil, right? At a time when not only are we struggling with the pandemic of the coronavirus, but we're struggling with the pandemic continually as it relates to issues of racism and injustice. And so how do we find peace, right, with all of that going on? And so for me, I had to think, this does make sense. Because when we can find peace and happiness and joy within ourselves, that's what will help us to make a more peaceful world. And so I really embraced that title. I had to give it some thought, like I said, but just thank you for doing this whole series. So I definitely wanted to kind of get that out of the way and make sure that I give tell you how grateful I am to be here today. And so about me, it's been a long path, and still it's going on. I'm still finding new things on that path as I move along. And so what I have to really go back in time to kind of tell a little bit about myself and how I come into this multicultural arts, and how can we use that as a tool to address all of these issues that we're so concerned with and that we want to see eradicated. And just thinking back about that, I've got to go all the way back to my own childhood, okay? I am one of 10 siblings. And I should say that I'd like to dedicate this show today to my eldest sister, Shirley McLean Houston, who passed away only 3 days ago. And she, along with my other older sisters and brothers, along with my parents, they were my first mentors. And my sister Shirley was an educator. She was a teacher. And so out of 6 sisters, 5 of us became educators, and she led the way in that. And in fact, one of the first Black teachers in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. So that's kind of that beginning piece for me. And then the second piece to that is I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and I was born in a town called Roxbury. Now, some people will know what Roxbury is, and I know I'm talking to a worldwide audience. But Roxbury, at the time that I was born, and I was born in 1954, that is a year that I think my path was already set. I think I signed a contract before I even came to this planet, okay, that I was going to be about social justice. I was going to be about cross-cultural connection to bring people together, because 1954, that was when Brown versus the Board of Education to integrate the schools. That was that year, 1954. And my dad, he was what I would call a community activist. He migrated from the South to the North and had a dream deferred as a Black man, going to the East Coast to pursue a mathematician profession, and unable to actually do that and be accepted into any college from the sciences, right? And so Roxbury, at the time that I was born, was probably about, I would say 95% of people of African descent. And the time, it's now very gentrified, as many of our cities are. But being born into a predominantly Black community, and having such a conscious father who wanted to see equal rights for all people, not just Black people, but equal rights for all people, that no one should suffer regardless of their class, their color, their religion. And so he stood very strongly on that principle. In fact, at 7 years old, he was taking me out of school to protest. So at 7 years old, I was marching, I was doing sit-ins in some of the churches. So when I think about the four beautiful young girls that died in the bombing, that could have been me sitting there, along with all of the other young girls and boys who would sit in the churches and sing the songs of freedom. And so just trying to give you a taste of what brought me into this work. And so it was my father, but not only my father, but my mother as well. And so you look at me, you look at my features, and you wonder, wow, well, she's of African descent, she's Black, but she looks very European. And that's another whole topic, actually. But to just share that with you, both of my parents are of African descent. My mother is Cabo Verdean, and those are islands that are off the coast of West Africa. And it's where the Portuguese colonized the African people of West Africa. And these are some of the blends that you get on the island. So a very mixed race from those islands. And then you have my father coming up from the South, coming from that McLean plantation, where we've had mixtures as well. So I can trace my great grandmother was actually, and father were actually enslaved. And so with all of this history, my parents made sure that we understood who we are, because identity is very important, especially when you live in a world that doesn't always see you for the gifts and the beauty that you have. And so this is what it's all about for me. So when I looked at becoming an educator, the very first thing that I did is I went into the fine arts. And so I was able to, even before starting college at 17, and again, I grew up in a housing development, a very, very poor community, but I sought out scholarships, as did many of us during that time period, because our parents wanted to make sure that we had those opportunities that they did not. And so with that, at 17, I started the National Center for African American Artists. And the subjects that I had at the center were dance, many different fortes of dance, I had visual, mainly fine arts painting, but I did sculpture. I did all of the mediums of art you can probably think about. And then I went on to Massachusetts College of Art, and I minored in multimedia, film and video. And I also kept my performing arts piece with that as well. What I learned in that time period, so when I would get an assignment in college, I would pull my community. I had 3 sisters. I had 1 sister and 2 brothers younger than me. They would end up, growing up, and there's, if you don't have things to do there, you can get into things that you don't need to get into. And so I pulled together about 25 kids out of our housing project, and I started the Children's Theatrical Group. And we performed at colleges throughout New England. And the performances that we did were performances that I wrote. One in particular that I still love today is called Who's Going to Save the Children? And that was inspired by Marvin Gaye's album on Who's Going to Save the Children. And again, that play toured for a very long time, but I learned then that I could take the love of art and I could take my dedication to social justice. I could merge those. And then I could reach many more people, whether or not if they were in audience, whether or not if they were participants. And I'll talk about a little later how we've turned this sort of melding of the arts and multicultural education. We turned it into developing curriculum. But that's my kind of a long but short version. It's much longer, so I'm hoping it was a bit condensed. But that was my start in knowing that this is definitely what I'm supposed to do. And art has such a way of bringing empathy. When you can have 400 people imagine that they are in a West African village in the middle of a celebration, and you have the drums going and the songs going. And then all of a sudden you see these raiders coming into the village. When you can dramatize that for people, when you can take them on that forced migration where people were chained and held in dungeons to await slave ships, when you can take them through that process, it is just an amazing way to reach a better understanding. And so that's the kind of work that I do. I bring that history to life, not only as it relates to African descent, but as you mentioned, I've been in 40 countries and there are always different kinds of issues that we're working with. But using the arts to do that is such a wonderful tool.
Wow, Karen, I am just in awe. I mean, there's several things here. First of all, I just want to acknowledge people are sending in comments. You have a few girlfriends here. Nyanda says, Dr. Dade, you look so beautiful. Felicia says, Dr. Dade is beautiful. We also have some people with some sympathy for the loss of your sister, commenting that. I personally just want to acknowledge, I'm one of 10 children also.
Wow.
And
you know what it's like.
Yeah, which number were you?
I am 4th from the bottom.
Okay, I was number 5, right in the middle. And I also, when you talk about the plays and so forth, one of the, I've lived in Sierra Leone for 4 years and then went back during the war with Search for Common Ground. And plays were a way of engaging the community. So when you describe enacting these plays and how they can bring people in and draw folks in, I mean, it must be really powerful experiences. So could you tell us a little bit about how audiences respond to like the raid and all of that and everything? Yeah,
and it's one thing that, and I think this is where my academic piece really comes in, because you have to have skills for that as well that go beyond just, putting together a performance to dramatize, to tell the story, because there's a lot of emotion that takes place with that. If you're doing that with a mixed group, and I've done it, and so I created this, believe it or not, in 1985, and it has not gotten old yet. I hope someday it will, actually, right? But there is reflection time throughout the this particular piece that I call From Africa to America. And I usually will not do that piece if we're not guaranteed 15 to 20 minutes to try to dissect what it is that we're feeling. If we're not taking the time to look at the socialization that goes on for all of us, that gives us some very different perspectives, and oftentimes those perspectives are clashing. And this is the hate and the things that we feel because we've been taught certain things. So it can be a shock to the system, first of all, to learn about these things. Sometimes I'm often surprised that so many of our young people who are of African descent, they don't know their history these days. And so it can be very emotional for them. It can come with anger. It can come with a flooding of tears. It can come in all kinds of ways as it relates to that. But at the same time, it comes that same way for whites and other people of color. And I'll oftentimes see when I talk, when there are people of color that are engaging, people of color, I'm talking about our First Nation people who so relate to that story. And each of us, when we talk culturally, we each have stories to tell. And so when I think about Mexican American students that I may have, who feel their ancestors, this was the land of their ancestors, and yet and still look and see what we're seeing today. So it brings on a lot of emotion. And this is why, in doing it so long, I've learned to integrate some humor in that, some fun. We're celebrating life when we begin. We talk about Africa being the cradle of civilization because still the oldest remaining bones were found in Africa and in Kenya area there. And so we all have lineage. So we kind of start from a place, a common ground, and then we continue to build out with that. And again, I've been doing this for so long. It actually came from a play that I wrote called Take a Picture of Me, Please. And I wrote this play for African-American children who were losing that history. And that was just one scene in this particular play that the kids were doing. But I held on to that scene because, again, it's a valuable workshop. And I've now taken that model, and I will now tell stories of other cultures using some similar models for that. But again, I'm also very conscious not to tell someone else's story, but to allow others to tell their own story. I simply will help them to give them the artistic pieces that go along with them for them to be able to create the story. So I'm hoping that I answered some of your questions on how we go about doing that, how people react in that particular way. Just like I do use the drama and the music, and we learn songs about love, right? We learn songs about being human beings. We learn about race being not a biological construct, but a social construct, right? Because there's only 3 chemicals in the skin, and all of these things are coming out in these different experiential workshops where we're using art. We may be doing some oil or acrylic painting, and I'll say, Our class today is about social justice. So what does that mean to you? Let's put that on canvas. And so I talk them through about colors, pigmentation, when we're using pigmentation paints to be able to paint. So there are many different ways that we can use the arts. And in a little while, I'll tell you the impact that that makes, because of course and you introduced me as an associate dean, and I certainly was. I've been a director of education and all of that, but I wanted to forego my administration positions to be back into the classroom, because as a professor, I'm a professor of education. And so I educate the students who are going to become teachers, who are going to be in that classroom. And when I see that those teachers are not prepared to teach students of all backgrounds, I worry. So for my last couple of years now, and I'm past retirement age for that, but I'm going to hang around a little while longer. I do have so many students. I have thousands of students, believe it or not, that have become teachers. They've gotten PhDs. So I've got second and third generations now. So I'm almost feeling comfortable enough to say, okay, you do all the work. But for now, I'm enjoying being back in the classroom, because we needed so much as far as better understanding, to know that we are beings in a human body experiencing the world. So why are we hating on one another? This is a beautiful thing, right? So.
Wow, wonderful. I can imagine your classes are filled to the brim.
Oh, they get pretty filled.
Yeah. And, so there's so much to this, and again, it's nice to hear your stories, and also to have seen how theater has been used across sub-Saharan Africa to engage communities, and then also in the United States too. And so for folks who might be new to this, tell us a little bit about if there's any particular processes that are intentional. Like, let me just give you an example. Like, Search for Common Ground would work in countries that have gone through war, like Sierra Leone, where I live. Yeah. And they would intentionally have people from the different factions work together to co-create, say, a radio soap opera.
Yeah.
And so they have the different voices from the factions. The process of working together would create a type of bridge building.
Absolutely.
And then there's also, in terms of designing the story, they would take the stories of people in the country and then fictionalize it into just a radio soap opera. Mm-hmm. And so people from around the country would be listening, like 90% listenership. So tell us a little bit about some of the intentionality of, like, the design process, having people work together, how they're creating the storyline, and what's the transformation that the performers go in, and then how that translates into what the audience experiences.
Okay, so I'll tell you a couple of things. So I'll share with you, a lot of folks they may know of Augusto Boal's work. And Augusto Boal also uses the arts for social justice means, and to address issues of oppression, et cetera, and so forth. And he's pretty much drama. He actually, to me, is so complementary to Paulo Freire's work. And so, just to tell a little story about Augusto's work. And so he was going from village to village, and I'm talking about South America, I'm talking about being in Brazil. And it was so convincing. So he got the people of the village, some of the people in the village were actually, and he does a lot of improvisation. And so he kind of shared with them what they were going to be sharing with the rest of the audience. And it was so believable that people were going to grab their guns and everything else to try to protect the village, right? And so I just love this concept of, and he then took that, he used that dissension between these groups to be able to have the dialogue that they needed to have. This is what it looks like. We've acted it out. And so let's talk about what's real with that and what are some of the, underpinning issues that we need to begin, to address with that. So you have some wonderful, I think, artists. They're few, but there are many around the world that are not many, but when I think about worldwide, I can think about more than what we have by way of artists who use social justice or use the arts to address social justice issues. So let me kind of share with you in my case. So one of the first big consulting jobs that I got was through Boston Public Schools. And there was a terrible rift. You had teachers that were disparaging the Black children that they were teaching. And that got out through a radio program, and just everything blew up in the city. And so I was asked, I was working on my doctorate at the time, and my doctorate is in education, but specialization, multicultural education, anti-racist education. So they asked me to come in to do a survey to begin with. I created a survey. We disseminated it to 2,000 8th and 12th graders. And in that survey, the main point that I want to make is that out of 2,000 kids, 88 children, I'm talking about children of various backgrounds, perceived racism in their schools. So that was so alarming that the school district asked me, can you go in and work with this particular high school? Because they're being hit the most with the teacher came from that particular school. Okay. So I developed a 10-week curriculum, an anti-racist curriculum for which each youngster got to tell their story. So there were 80 kids that signed up out of 2,000. The kids had to be, I said that they had to be honor students. And the reason why I said they had to be honor students, because in this field, I know that when children say something is racist, it's often dismissed by our teachers to say that you're just embellishing, you're just making an excuse to fail, you're using a crutch, right? So I didn't want to have that. I wanted to see if in fact these young people that applied and wanted to come into the 10-week program, and they were honor students, peer educators, would they have issues? Well, lo and behold, the 40 that I casted to create their own play on racism in schools, each and every one of those 40 students, and they were a mixture of students, they were Black, white, and Latinx. And each one of those students had stories to share that would, and that's my very first book. That became my dissertation, Through Students' Eyes, Combating Racism in the United States Schools. And so they wrote a play to stop racism in their schools. So first of all, it had an impact on the students themselves. It had an impact on the school. The school district asked if the students could perform that piece throughout the school district. So it had an impact on teachers and students and administrators, and it was all coming from the voices of young people. I simply guided them, for their acting and projection and the things that they needed to get out. But they pretty much wrote their storyline. And so you had stories. I'm just going to quickly give you a sense of what these kids were talking about. We had one Puerto Rican young male who was going into advanced math class. He has a slip in his hand. He knocks on the door, and the teacher's blocking the door for him to get in. He's knocking. She says out of the door, "What do you want?" And he says, "I think I belong in this class." She comes out the door, she snatches his paper, and she sees that he's in the right class, and she says, "Well, you better not act up while you're in here. Do you understand me?" Right? And he looked in the class. There were all white students in this, what we call AP class, right? College-bound class. 2 weeks later, the teacher came up to him and said, "Hey, you're not such a bad kid after all, and you're really smart. You can really do that math." He wanted to know, why did this teacher prejudge him before he could even make it into the classroom? Another Puerto Rican girl, another math class, the teacher comes up in front of all the kids and says, "You know, you better work 10 times harder than everybody else in this classroom, because we know that all Puerto Rican girls get pregnant by the age of 15. She cried. She hid under her tape, under her desk with embarrassment. We had a Trinidadian American girl who was put into a special needs classroom, kept there for 6 weeks, for the 6 months. When suddenly a substitute teacher came in and said, "You don't belong in this classroom. Why are you in this class? You know, you belong in an honors classroom." And he found out that she was put in that class because of her accent. And because people could not understand her as clearly, they thought that she was not a smart child. Tons of stories that these kids then compiled those stories into their production. But they ended on such a beautiful note. And when they talked about, well, how did they make it through? They're honest students, right? They're on their way to college, and some didn't want to go to college if it was going to mean the same thing. But they said, our parents, our communities that supported us, our teachers who gave us special care, and there were so few of them for them. So I could go on and on, but that's empirical data. That was the first data that we had, that we listened to young people and how they were being impacted and how much they wanted to live in a peaceful environment where everyone could get along. And so many times, whether or not if I developed a study abroad program that lasted for 5 years while I was at Iowa State University. And it was an exchange program between Iowa State, which is at the time 94% white, right? And South Africa. And we were just coming out of, Nelson Mandela had just become president, and they needed work badly. They needed work badly. The teachers were still segregating the kids in their classroom. And they labeled them, this is my clever group, this is my not so clever group, and this group you don't even need to pay attention to. And those were the Black children that they didn't need to pay attention to. And this is long after Nelson Mandela had become president, that the schools stayed that way. I was called to India to work with the Ministry of Education to do non-discriminatory curriculum development for the children because of the dark skin. The darker you are, the caste system still exists. The children were not given water. I mean, this is on the basis of being darker skinned, sitting in the back of the classroom, not to hear the lecture, going to the Philippines. So we think that when we talk about anti-racism, when we talk about racism, we think we're just, those of us in America, we think we're just talking, and I say United States because America is South and North. But, you know, they think that it's just happening here because that system, we are the masters of this system that we're in, that we call racism. But it's so spread throughout the world. But when we give our young people a chance to have a voice to say how it's impacting them and how it can be corrected, I personally say that all of us, educators, those of us who want to see peace and justice in this world, that we have to listen to our young people and understand what their needs are, right? So those are just some of the stories. I think what makes me unique in this work is people often want to think that the arts are a frill. That's the first thing that they take out of the curriculum, right? And sports. And one of the things that I was very committed to show was to show that, quite on the contrary, so many cultural groups, this is our lifestyle. This is the way that we live. We are engaged in the arts and cultural arts because it's our way of being. And you know, you were there in Sierra Leone. You know that culture is so much a part of who the people are, right? And so, but I had to prove that as an academic. And so it resulted in me doing lots of seminal work, especially with young people, to actually show the impact that it has on their development, on their behavior, on what they internalize about themselves. And so it's a re-education process, and I'm only able to sell that re-education process because on top of saying, here's all the beautiful things we've done, and we can see that in video and all these other things, but here's the research that really breaks it down, that shows people that, you know, we've gone through a form of socialization that is so psychological that it's caused mental illness within our society as it relates to racism. It's a disease.
Wow, powerful. Very, very powerful. We're getting lots of comments over here. People just really taking in what you're saying here. We have someone from the Philippines who's commenting. And let's see, who's that?
Love the Philippines.
Yeah, Lisa from the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So there's quite a bit here. One person said that she was flowers, that she was in AP for so long, it was like prison. AP is reproduction of status quo. She said, I dropped out of high school twice. My high school was Arlington Heights, John Denver.
Arlington?
Yeah. So she says that Martin Luther King Jr. and Thich Nhat Hanh are her masters. Yeah, so you're striking a chord with people here. So how can folks engage with you how can people find, I posted your website there. How can they engage with you, learn from you, apply it in either their family, churches, schools, or communities, and so forth?
Thanks for asking that question, Philip, because I think it's one that I'm really, you know, when you work a full-time job, and I'm not only talking about with the university, but also in being CEO of my own company, I don't often have the time as much to do all the consultant work. But now that I'm winding down, and I actually have a free summer, everyone, this is a time when I'd love for you to contact me via the website or DM me on Instagram. And I'm also on Facebook. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to work with your organizations. I would love to have the opportunity. I love young people, but I do think that the work has to be done with those who are working with our young people, right? And so I would welcome you to get in touch with me. Let's find out what we can do. When you teach for over 40 years, as I teach my students to have a bag load of tools, strategies, right? And I think my strategies go outside this door, right? right here. And so when we want to customize, when we want to do, we have particular issues and things that we're wanting to look at, this is where it's valuable to seek your elders, right? And I'm taking that on now. I was kind of cast that as an elder by some of my college students recently, a wise elder. And so that's kind of sticking with me with that. And I think not just, yes, I'm 66, but not just with appearance, but with experience, that eldership comes in. So that's what I would say to folks. Right now is a great time to get in touch with me. I'm online again for the fall. We've had some trips canceled. You know, I still do lots of study abroad programs, taking students, because students have to see the world. Now we're bringing the world to them through Zoom and other means of technology. And believe it or not, I just taught my spring course, and I was able to do a lot of experiential work via Zoom. I didn't think, I kind of felt like, you really have to be there in that room and feel that vibe. But this is the closest thing to it right now for us. But it actually works pretty well. So I am so open to so many things, especially, multicultural education. We're talking about all the various isms. We're talking about all the different identities and people that are oppressed. So within that, I'm very strong. That's my area of expertise. But I feel, as a woman of African descent, that this is something on top of working in areas of cross-cultural studies and multicultural education, that I want people to particularly begin to understand the insidious aspects of racism, but doing that creatively can help to take a lot of stress off of the learning process. If we just understand we weren't born like this, we were socialized like this, so let's unlearn and relearn the ways in which we should treat one another in a humane way. So
wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. I mean, we're having more comments here. Experiential is very good. Immediate consequence is so important. Thank you so much. Love you, from Felicia.
Okay.
And lots of comments. And here we were talking about this context, and we didn't even touch upon the fact of what's happening in the world right now in terms of George Floyd's, death, killing.
Absolutely.
The response. I mean, there's a hunger right now.
Yes.
For what you and other people are offering. So
yeah, and I would like to say that about the world involvement right now and how encouraging that is. And we all have a role to play in that. As I told you, I started on protest lines at the age of 7. I've marched to Washington, D.C. I've been all a part of that whole civil rights movement as a young person, right? And so I believe that we have to have our voices heard, and peaceful protests are very important. However, so is the therapist that wants to begin to help to see community through understanding what this disease is all about. The educator, we all have different, again, roles to play in this work. But I encourage those of you this summer who are out there, who are protesting, we have to understand the important things that we need to ask for. For instance, I believe in the Juneteenth. That is the African American Independence Day. And it's good for us to call for that for a national holiday. But we already know, I've been celebrating that since a child. So we already know that that's important, and we want the world to know about that and the rest of our history. At the same time, there are some very other important things that we need to be saying, this is what we need as well, right? So I'm hoping that we're asking for things. And for instance, we need better education. When our children open up those textbooks, every child should be able to see themselves in that curriculum, right? Every teacher needs the kind of training that will open their hearts to being able to allow for children to have an excellent means of being able to learn about the world. So as we're protesting, protest for, we talked about the equity and the equality, the fairness, right? The inclusion, the diversity. Those are all things that we really need to come together on around the world. We need to know what people are doing in other parts of the world, because it's not, it will surprise you maybe, but it shouldn't, because they have so many of those same experiences that we're having as well. So the more people that we have that want to engage in this summer of peace, in this summer of peace that I hope turns into an everlasting summer of peace, that I'm really hoping that it will. So there's a lot of work to do out here. Do not pull people down when they're out trying to give their expertise. And it doesn't mean that everyone, yes, we have a lot of people who don't understand what's going on. And therefore they say a lot of hateful things. They do a lot of hateful things. There's a lot of discrimination. Let's not focus on their hate. Let's focus on our love and focus on our inner being, to love ourselves and to become poised in the peace that we all need to have. And then that energy, because we're all connected. Okay, so I didn't get into my spiritual side of this, but there's a very important spiritual side to this that will carry us through. But Philip, I'm having more hope, and I've seen all of the cycles, I'm telling you, all of the protests, all of the things, and yet and still you asked about, George Floyd. In every book that I've written, there's been a litany of African, especially African men that were killed in that particular year that I wrote a particular book, right? We know that this is over 400 years for those of African descent, whether or not if they were dying through lynching and through the system of slavery, or dying today, 2020, in the ways that they're dying. It should not be. It should not be. So George Floyd, I mean, I have to speak up for Breonna, who we don't mention the women, who have lost their lives through such brutality. And so that's part of my artwork too. You'll see in some of my artwork, it's very conscious of the lives that we've lost. It's very symbolic of the things that are happening in the world. I hope one day I can paint pictures where we're all standing together as human beings in love and appreciation and gratitude. That's probably my biggest hope. And so my tears go out for George and all those who have lost their lives. My first exposure was Emmett Till at 14 years old. And I was a young child at that point in time as well. So we have a lot to do, world. We have a lot to do. And if Philip and others continue to, give us a platform to be able to teach and to understand and to enjoy one another more and appreciate and have gratitude, I think that we're going to come out on top. It's got to be that way, or else we'll destroy the world for the generations to come. So it's our obligation.
Wonderful, Karen. How inspiring. I mean, it's just really wonderful. And, you know, we've got Yes, Love Wins from Adrian. There's lots of comments here. Truth, Honor, and Integrity show from Russia. That's a comment from
Wow.
Russia.
I have not been to Russia.
Yeah. So yeah, folks in Russia, you hear that? You've got someone to invite there, at least by Zoom. So again, Karen, thank you so much for who you are, what you're doing, and you know, and how you're doing it. And it's just really wonderful to have you here with us on the Summer of Peace. So I want to thank you.
You are welcome.
And I want to thank everybody who's been listening, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or night. Have a wonderful rest of your day there. And please share this interview with people far and wide. So thank you all for being with us. Bye-bye.
Ashe, peace to all.